I experience all this. The thing I keep thinking about is an anti-gay slur that begins with the letter F. Mm-hmm. This was a very commonly deployed word in my teenage years. Mm-hmm. It brings me great shame that that's the case. I mean, horrible shame that that's the case. Mm-hmm. It was a fairly liberal milieu in New York City public schools, but people used it. I'm sure I used the word. And it was used in a pretty awful way. In a way that blows my mind now, like that it was. I mean, blows my mind when I think about it. And I guess what I have to do is I have to figure out whatever theory you're espousing, okay, how it integrates to me the clear and obvious moral progress of the fact that word was exiled, and that I think my understanding is that I think 15-year-olds don't really deploy it.
Not as much.
Not as much.
Right.
And so the question is, well, what's the theory for how that good stuff happens? And how do we distinguish that from the stuff that you think is sort of scary and totalitarian?
Right. So, yes, shame is something that will always have a place in society, and it gets great things done, such as getting rid of the common use of slurs like that, such as, holding adultery down to a certain level, such as keeping...
It's an amazing second example.
Frankly, it's one I always think of.
Working well enough to hold it down a bit.
Down a bit. Keeping people from smoking as much as they used to. Yes, shame is something that can be useful, but the issue here is what we decide we want to happen. I think there is a critical mass of people who say that it is a good thing that those sorts of slurs aren't used as freely as they were about 10 minutes ago. But the problem is that we're using that same kind of shame to do things where I don't think we have that kind of consensus. And so, quick example, Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, the head of it says that he's not going to stop taking white artists into consideration for being part of the museum's collection completely. He wants to look at a more diverse range of artists, certainly, but he's not going to look away from white artists completely because that would constitute reverse racism. Because he used the term reverse racism, that man was fired. Now, the question is, to what end? And so you may say, we're going to use shame to keep people from ever saying reverse racism because a certain cadre of people believe that there's no such thing as a black person being racist. And of course, there's a whole lot of controversy over that, but never mind, those people say it loud enough. And next thing you know, that man is fired so that what? Now, of course, this is being done in the context of this racial reckoning, the idea being that his being fired for saying that makes this a better world because it helps to dismantle structures of entrenched racism. But really, does it? When about a half mile across town, there are plenty of black people who are starving out on the streets. And the effort that went into getting Gary Garrels fired could have gone into efforts to address the homelessness problem in San Francisco. I find that that is where the shame is being used by a small number of scary people to do something most people would consider unnecessary.
Right. So there's some common ground here, I think, which I want to mine. So one of the critiques is a kind of Vanguardism, right? There's a critique that says some vanguard of people who have come up with some set of prohibitions and their representativeness and their power is a little unclear, like where's it come from, are now prescribing things. And that's not reflective, they don't represent anyone, right? So that's like one of the arguments, I think. And I think to go back to the Seuss, the Seuss example, what was interesting about the Seuss example is that I watched it ping back and forth and I sort of, again, in this kind of very polarized way. And I thought it was a little silly that they were reading Seuss on the floor of the House of Representatives. And then, someone on our staff, I said, did anyone upload all these books? I would like to look at all of them, right? So so they uploaded them and I looked at them and it was sort of fascinating because, there's one image that's just like shockingly off. Transparently racist.
The African natives, right?
Exactly, yes. Yeah. The African natives in a way that yes, that's... Yeah.
That would shock anybody seeing it today.
There's a picture of a man in Mulberry Street who's called a Chinaman.
And I have that here in my house and have showed it to my girls. And I've said, this is an old book. This is something they used to pull then. That's not what Chinese people are like.
Right. And that's I think also racist and also I think defensible to get rid of it, but a little more borderline on the Africans. Again, I'm a white man who's making these judgments, so these are not.
I feel the same way. Yeah,
I'm just talking about myself, right? Then there's McGilligot's Pool, and you get to what I think was there's an Eskimo at some point. And it's a very it's a cartoonish Eskimo,
right?
In sort of heavy fur kind
with
of
the parka, right?
Yeah. And I think that was the offending image in that book. But one of the points that, David Wallace Wells pointed out in I thought a pretty good piece in the New Yorker that cased this controversy was like, it's not clear that there were complaints from indigenous people of, say, Alaska about this book and image. Someone somewhere decided that this was offensive to, they had this panel of, I think, scholars, I think they put together. But that to me does, like, this question of sort of representation and who's doing the deciding does seem to matter to me, right? So there's a place where, like, I don't know the history and the harm of the images of indigenous folks, particularly indigenous folks of Alaska, has been. If those people said, this is a very harmful image, we should find, then I would be like, yeah, that seems like that makes sense. But in this case, it did feel like it was just unclear where it came from.
Yeah, and this is why another thing that's worrisome about all of this, there's the issue of representativeness, and there's the issue of what the real purpose often seems to be. And we use a term virtue signaling, and it's getting so loaded that it's become almost a slur in itself. But what I'm seeing is a certain kind of person, usually white, who is trying to show that they understand oppression. And it's important that people show that they understand oppression. 50 years ago, nobody would have ever heard of such a thing. But if what you're doing is showing that you understand oppression by doing things that even the people of color don't really care about, then something is wrong. With Dr. Seuss, the world's going to keep spinning. But this sort of thing is also, as we both know, losing people jobs.
Okay, so then that gets to the second point, I think, of some common ground, which I actually think is sort of an interesting left-right synthesis here, which is this. To me, some of the most questionable examples of this are happening in institutions that are themselves fiercely inegalitarian, hierarchical, often white-dominated, both presently and historically, that are rather than, like, it's like, there's the stories about private schools, right? So, Dalton or something. It's like, well, how do you make an egalitarian and woke Dalton? And it's like, you can't. That's the whole, like, and that maybe that's true of the San Francisco Museum. Like, to me, a lot of the excesses here actually seem to not be about genuine investment in social justice so much as they seem to be often white-dominated institutions doing some weird performance of equality so as to preserve the institution, which is itself in its absolute DNA and fundaments inegalitarian.
And of course, the thing is that I think a lot of these people will see that no matter what happens, and this is where it gets into a side of this that I hate to talk about. Now, I'm a black person, and I don't like saying this about the black side of this, but in many cases, the people in question will never be satisfied. And so, for example, I doubt, from what I've seen of the whole Dalton scenario, that anything that was done would keep a certain contingent from not continuing to say that we need to address the past and that we need to make this a completely non-racist institution. And the problem with it is that what you see in many of, for example, these institutions or these artistic endeavors is a very artificial notion that the issue of oppression and the issue of systemic racism is somehow the main thing that we must be thinking about that dominates in importance anything else for the foreseeable future. That is a point one might make carefully, and you would convince some people, but it's hardly truth. And we're being taught to pretend that, for example, a Dalton where learning about oppression ends up dominating every single subject, we're supposed to pretend that that is ineluctable, unassailable truth incarnate. And it simply isn't. We're pretending. And that's the problem. All of this involves so much mendacity and, as you say, performance. And it means that it's an unhealthy society we're creating.